and welcome to CNBC TV 18 Citizens Monetary Policy Committee. The budget is behind us and now there is a monetary policy ahead of us. The last inflation reading was a benign 2.19%. But the budget has fiscal stimulus written all over it. So what should RBI's MPC do? Does it have space for a cut? The CNBC TV 18 Citizens Monetary Policy Committee is here to decode just that. I have with me Chairman Pranab Sen and members Samiran Chakraborty of Citi, Sajid Chenoy of JP Morgan, Soumyakant Ghosh of SBI and Sonal Verma of Nomura joining us from Singapore. Gentlemen and lady, welcome to the show. Let me start with the lady. Sonal, well, now when the RBI and the MPC meet on February 6th and 7th, what are the concerns that they need to address? Should they be relaxed about the last inflation reading, which was pretty low, or should they worry that future inflation could be a little higher?
I think, the aggregate scenario needs to be considered. So on the growth front, clearly, relative to the projections that the RBI has right now, which still sees growth at, in fact, above 7.2% even in FY20. The global outlook itself suggests that risks are to the downside, and I don't think the fiscal impulse will be enough to sustain growth above 7%. So risks to the growth or to the downside. On inflation, headline, of course, has undershot because of food. There's the mystery around core and why rural health education inflation has been very high, I think, remains a mystery right now. At the margin, I think the key uncertainty right now is to what extent the more consumer consumption, farm-oriented fiscal impulse is going to, and whether it's going to lead to inflation or not. Our assessment overall is that even if we take the fiscal additional growth impulse into account, average inflation over a 12-month horizon should still be in the 4% range on an average over the next 12 months. So I think overall, therefore, taking a considered view of all factors, the risk to growth forecasts are to the downside. The fiscal side is a concern at the margin, but on average, inflation should still stay within the 4% target. So that's sort of a more considered view that one needs to take on an aggregate. Fiscal, of course, at the margin, a bit of a negative.
Okay. Well, Samiran, would you be as relaxed about inflation, considering that it's not just the central fiscal stimulus? First of all, how much is the stimulus, if you can give us a number? And there is also the state's loan waivers kind of stimulus. Possibly another coalition coming to power, if it does, could also be promising the moon. Would you worry that fiscal stimulus can pull up the inflation number?
So if I look at the overall quantum of the stimulus, 0.3% of GDP of the rural package and 0.1% from the income tax, that's about 0.4% of GDP. In fact, if I look at my pre-budget estimates, this is at the lowest end of the spectrum of numbers that we were hoping for. So in that sense, one should not be superly worried about this 0.4% of GDP fiscal stimulus. We have seen in the past that the revenue expenditure side has a relatively lesser multiplier than the capital expenditure on overall growth also. So at this moment, not so worried about the core inflation impact arising out of it. But where I'm slightly worried is that even if I take this curious case of health and education inflation out of the core is still 5% plus. So, yes, I am also quite appalled and we have no explanation of why this is going up in this fashion. But because the rest of the core is also high, I would probably be a bit more worried on inflation, because in our adaptive expectation way of looking at things, we are, in a sense, last 3 quarters of low food inflation. We are projecting it out. And if the final purpose of all this stimulus is to get food from deflation to inflation at some point of time during the course of the year. Because if that does not happen, then the whole package is practically useless. So if I try to build that into framework where core inflation, and I'm taking off the health education part, is still high, then although we have a 4.5 December 2019 forecast, there could be upside risk to that forecast, particularly if there are any kind of supply-side shocks on food.
Okay. So the worry is not fisc so much, but the fact that anyway core inflation is high. How would you react to the same set of factors, Sajid? Do you worry that core inflation, and why should we consider even education and medical one-off?
So let me make two observations. One is I think that that's important that the MPC preserve the sanctity of the framework. And the framework is they have to go after headline inflation being close to 4%. That was the same logic the MPC used in October when people were clamoring for a hike, when the rupee was under pressure. And they were right to say ultimately everything has to flow through inflation and growth. By that yardstick, if you look out over the next 3 quarters, we see inflation meaningfully below 4%. As far as the eye can see. Now, we can always project inflation 4 or 5 quarters down the line and say it's above 4% then, but frankly, the standard error around these forecasts are very high given the quantum of uncertainty 1 year from now. Given that in the next 6 to 9 months, inflation is comfortably below 4%, I think, and given the fact that the Fed has given central banks in emerging markets a bit of a free pass, I think sticking to the sanctity of the framework is important. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of unpredictability if the middle of the game we change the goalpost. And I think some space for modest monetary easing is opened up. The second point I'll make is the one Shaumaran made. The analytical question for all of us is, if you project a year or two out, given this wide divergence between food to core, what eventually converges to what? Will food inflation go to core inflation, or will core inflation come down to food inflation? Our analysis has suggested that things have changed the last 6 years. When I was in the Urjit Patel Committee report between 2000 and 2012, we found that actually core would go towards food, right? And therefore, headline became the inflation target. But the last 6 years, the data is very clear. It's basically headline that eventually goes to core. So there is reason, for all the reasons Shaumaran laid out, to be cautious 12, 18 months from now, because that's how long it takes for these things to converge. But over the next 2-3 quarters, I think that the inflation numbers are so compelling that the MPC, I think, will have a little space here to breathe.
Okay. Just one quick comment on Sajid's first point. While I agree that the MPC has this quite well written about the headline inflation, the challenge also is that in October they have communicated that the definition of the stance of calibrated tightening is rate cuts are off the table. So if they now do a stance change and a rate cut together, then is it sticking to what they had said earlier?
Okay.
Just a small point.
That is going to be everybody's point also. Can you do both in one? But I'll come back to you all on stance as well. Before I get to the chairman, since he will have to make the wrap-up comments on the inflation and the macroeconomic factors, Shaumyo, are there any global factors to consider over here? Are they quite clearly benign? And therefore, what is your inflation forecast?
I think just a little point about the global conditions. I think global conditions currently are showing diverging trends, and there are clearly two contrarian views. One view is saying that possibly the US, the slowdown is synchronous and is around the corner. There is the other view is that slowdown is possibly a little later. So there is still not consensus whether the global economy is going to slow down meaningfully in 2019 or maybe later.
Okay, but I want you to tell me whether the state and the central fiscal stimulus, what is the quantum and what mischief can it do?
Exactly. So now coming to inflation or the central fiscal, I think the fiscal numbers, if you look into it totality, yes, there is an element of fiscal impulse, and the projections which have been made in the budget are a little bit ambitious. Just to give you a sense of the number, the total tax collections for FY20 is around, I think, made to be around 14% or so. But this year's number is close to 20%, whereas the decadal growth rate is actually 14%. So in case there is even a 5 to 10% shortfall in the tax collections, then that could actually meaningfully push up the total revenue numbers for next year, which is going to be difficult to achieve. And as we know, there is an 19,000 additional borrowing through dated securities, 25,000 additional borrowing to small savings. So that number 45,000 in the next 2 months, crore is not a small number. So there is an element of fiscal impulse, but the question is how quickly it can actually push up the inflation. That brings me to the last point about the inflation. I think, yes, there is an element of upward surge in the core inflation, but I think the numbers in the core inflation is still a mystery. We have been trying to understand what are the reasons. I mean, possibly the prices may not be the reason. One of the reasons which is being given out or not, I mean, been informally talked about, is a change in the methodology, how the CSO is collecting the data. If that is the case, then that could actually open up on Pandora's box, because in that case, it is a possibility that could be better price discovery. Because even if I leave aside health, in education also, a lot of...
You are saying this core inflation can persist?
No, what I'm trying to say is that as long as there is no clarification from the CSO in why exactly how the data is changing, I think it's very uncertain to say which way the core could move. Cool. But at the end of the day, I think the core is still meaningfully down, because if you look into the urban core, that is 5.26%, the rural core has gone up. And if you strip aside, if we just only look into the headline inflation number, rural, and if I strip aside this health and education component, the rural headline inflation today is around 1.2%. So that means that inflation is still not a concern, but I am concerned how this core is going to behave, because if it's a price discovery, then there could be some other way of looking into the data.
The very mention of the word CSO opens up Pandora's box, but I am not going down that road at all. Dr. Sen, can you put all this into perspective for us? There is a rise in core inflation, and yet the rural distress indicates that they're not making enough money at all. And the persistent question is, India's real interest rates are very high. If the RBI is at 6.5 and rural inflation is at less than 2, overall inflation is close to 2, where is the justification not to cut?
Well, let's not go into the justification for a cut.
Okay.
But just let's look at what's happening and what it implies.
Sure.
We've talked about the fiscal stimulus. That's only one part of the story, and as I think Shomiran rightly pointed out, it's not huge, it's nothing that should scare us terribly. But the side we are not looking at, and that's what I would urge the others to take a quick call on, is that this 75,000 crores that's projected to go as rural income support is actually injection of liquidity into the rural cash economy, which hasn't happened in a while. One of the problems we've had is that the cash economy was suffering for liquidity. This is a direct liquidity transfer, so the monetary mechanisms in the rural economy hopefully should perk up. Now, whether they're going to perk up enough to reverse this trend in falling agricultural prices, I don't know. I don't think the sums are large enough to do it as yet. But at least it's the first reversal of a trend that's been going on for 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Okay.
So you can see actually not just agricultural price revival, you may see the MSME sector reviving as well with this kind of liquidity injection. So I think there is an upside there which we are not taking into account.
Okay.
So on the whole, my take on what's happening is that the fiscal stimulus is there. It's not overly worrying, but the more important thing is that rural revival seems to be a possibility now. And I think that's something we need to support rather than get worked up and try and nip it in the bud.
Okay, that's clearly giving us some idea of what is in your mind. Dr. Sen and members, I have to take a quick break, but I'm coming back and asking you all whether only the stance has to change, whether an action is needed, and any other factors that the MPC has to consider. We're back in a jiffy.